The Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1841. Although The Murders in the Rue Morgue is Poe's first detective story in which C. Auguste Dupin appears, and arguably the first detective story ever written, I chose to read the purloined letter in class first for a couple of reasons. First, by Poe's own admission in a letter to James Russell Lowell, which I mentioned in the lecture on the purloined letter, Poe acknowledged that the purloined letter was a better story than The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and its sequel, The Mystery of Marie Roget. Second, I wanted to discuss in more detail the immense influence The Murders in the Rue Morgue had on popular culture as part of our last week of class. I already pointed out Poe's influence in Doyle's creation of Holmes and Watson. In The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Dupin is the reclusive, highly observant detective, and he also has a sidekick, his Dr. Watson, who remains unnamed and is the narrator of the story. Holmes' famous method of using logic and deduction comes from Poe's method of ratiocination, which we will discuss in detail in a moment. That method went on to inspire other famous detective fiction authors and their heroes. Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, George Simenon's Maigret, Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe, Dashiell Hammett's Sam Spade, and Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer, to name just a few of the more famous characters from literature. There are, of course, many more derivatives in other genres, such as Batman and Dick Tracy in the comics, Perry Mason, Kojak, Columbo, and Adrian Monk on television, and Inspector Clouseau in the Pink Panther movies. It is clear that The Murders in the Rue Morgue is canonical in the genre of detective fiction. The Murders of the Rue Morgue was one of the earliest works of Poe translated into French and made Poe initially more famous in Europe than in the United States. Benjamin Welton, in the real-life inspiration of Edgar Allan Poe's first detective story, calls our attention to Vidocq, France's most famous and quite real detective of Poe's day. Welton observes that in A Study in Scarlet, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's first story that introduces Sherlock Holmes to the world, actually mentions Dupin in the text, a clear nod and attribution to Poe. Sherlock rose and lit his pipe. No doubt you think you are complimenting me and comparing me to Dupin, he observed. Now, in my opinion, Dupin was a very inferior fellow. That trick of his of breaking in on his friend's thoughts with an apropos remark after a quarter of an hour's silence is really very showy and superficial. He had some analytical genius, no doubt, but he was by no means such a phenomena as Poe appeared to imagine. In this way, Holmes both acknowledges his predecessor and distances himself from him. While this may seem rather arrogant, Holmes had an inspiration for his actions, Dupin himself. Unlike Holmes, in Dupin's first appearance, the detective does not call out a fictional rival, but the real Vidocq. In The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Dupin describes Vidocq as a good guesser and a persevering man, but without educated thought, he erred continually by the very intensity of his investigations. In The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Dupin does not err in his conclusions, and in the end, the startling murders are solved thanks to his genius. Eugène Vidocq, like Dupin, was a Frenchman who had a mysterious background. More than likely born in the northern city of Arras in 1775, Vidocq lived during some of France's most unsettled days. He lived through the French Revolution, fought in the Franco-Prussian War, and served under Napoleon, the restored Bourbon monarchy, and even the Second Republic. Even though he spent the majority of his early life as a con man and a thief, Vidocq could lay claim to being the founder of France's civil police force, the Sûreté Nationale, and being Europe's first private detective. When The Murders in the Rue Morgue was published, the name Vidocq, who was still alive and working at the time, had the same cultural recognition that Sherlock Holmes has today. In addition to being the first famous detective, Vidocq was also the first detective to write his memoirs, which were published in 1828 with the help of his friends Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, and Henri de Balzac. Although the memoirs were truth, not fiction, one could argue that his publication is truly the first work of detective literature. So Poe, of course, has Dupin discredit Vidocq just as Sherlock Holmes attempts to distance himself from Dupin. The list of Poe's influences almost seems endless, and we obviously don't have time to discuss all of them in detail, but I would like to bring up one last influence that may interest some of you: Poe's influence on Alfred Hitchcock. In a blog titled Nevermore, Evermore, How Poe Lives in Hitchcock, Amelia McQuirk makes interesting comparisons between Hitchcock's films and Poe's stories, including Vertigo and Ligeia, Shadow of a Doubt and The Fall of the House of Usher, Strangers on a Train and William Wilson, and The Birds, and The Telltale Heart. We don't have the time, unfortunately, to examine these comparisons in detail, but if you're interested in Hitchcock, you may want to have a look at this article. It may even inspire a paper topic. I've put a link to the article in the supplemental reading section. So let's go back to The Murders of the Rue Morgue. The story opens with a lengthy explanation of ratiocination. What is ratiocination? It's the process of forming judgments by a process of logic or reason. Since several of you have complained that philosophical Poe or critical Poe is difficult to understand, let me try a little trick that I learned in graduate school when I first started to learn how to read philosophy. I will paraphrase the opening of the story in my own words. I will focus some time on this since most of the rest of the story is just plot-driven, as a detective story usually is. The story is meant for reading pleasure and entertainment, not any deep philosophical thought. Once we get the introduction out of the way, the rest of the story will be enjoyable. So here is a paraphrase of the opening of the story. We rarely actually analyze the process of thinking analytically. We just enjoy the end result and derive entertainment from someone who possesses highly analytical skills. Just as the strong man enjoys showing off his muscles, the analyst enjoys showing off his skills. He enjoys solving puzzles and is so good at it that the solving of a puzzle actually appears as intuitive rather than an acquired skill. Analytical skills are often aligned with mathematics, but that is not fair because calculation is not the same as analysis. A chess player, for example, calculates without analyzing. I would argue that the simple game of checkers, a game of drafts, requires a higher intellect and more analysis than the frivolous game of chess. In chess, in which pieces have different and strange moves, people think that complexity means profundity. What matters in chess is attention. Chess has many possible, intricate moves, which increases the potential to overlook an implication of a move. So 90% of the time, the player who wins is the one who concentrates the hardest. In checkers, on the other hand, in which all the moves are the same, the probability of inattentiveness is lessened, so attention plays a less role in the game. What matters is who has the superior ability to make quick decisions. To be less abstract, suppose we are playing a game of checkers where the pieces have been reduced to 4 kings and where no mistake is to be expected. Since the players are equal, the victory can only be decided by some rare or obscure movement, which is the result of some strong brain use. Lacking regular resources, the analyst gets into the head of his opponent and as a result often sees the only ways, sometimes even simple ones, that he can confuse his opponent into an error. The game of whist has long been identified with analysis, and smart men have been known to really enjoy the game while turning their noses up at chess. There is undoubtedly nothing more challenging to the analytical brain than whist. The best chess player in the world may be little more than the best chess player, but proficiency in whist implies someone who is capable of intellectual achievements that extend way beyond the playing of a game. By proficiency, I mean a perfect knowledge and comprehension of all aspects of the game that gives the player the ultimate advantage. These aspects are multiple and varied and lie frequently deep in the player's mind, inaccessible to regular understanding. Observing leads to remembering, and so the chess player who concentrates will do well in playing whist. Also, the card rules of Hoyle, based merely on the mechanism of the game, are easy to learn. So having a good memory and playing by the rules are what most would consider necessary to become a good player. But it's beyond knowing the rules that the skill of an analyst is revealed. The analyst silently makes a number of observations and reasoning. So maybe do the other players, and the difference in the amount of information lies not so much in the validity of the reasoning as in the quality of the observation. What is important is knowing what to observe. Our player does not restrict his observations to the game, but also includes observations outside the game. He examines the expression of his partner, comparing them with the other players. He observes how the players sort the cards in their hands, thus often being able to determine how many trump cards and how many honor cards his opponents have. He watches variations of facial expressions during each play, collecting expressions of certainty, surprise, triumph, and frustration. He watches the player picking up his winning hand to determine whether the player can take another in the same suit. He's able to determine if a player is pretending by the way he throws down a card. He takes note of a casual word, the accidental dropping or turning of a card that is accompanied by anxiety or carelessness. He keeps count of the number of tricks, their order, embarrassment, hesitation, eagerness, or hesitation, all perceptions that help him appear intuitive about what is going on during the game. After playing 2 or 3 rounds, he is then capable of reading the players and thus their cards, and can play his own hand with such confidence as if the other players all had the faces of their cards turned to him. Analytic power should not be confused with just being clever, because while the analyst must be clever, the clever man is often remarkably unable to be analytical. The power of construction, which is usually how cleverness shows itself, and to which phrenologists have assigned a separate organ in the brain, assuming that it is a basic ability, has been seen in people who are otherwise idiots, especially among writers who write about morality. There is a difference between cleverness and analytical ability that is far greater than that between fancy and the imagination, a direct reference to Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, in which he defines the difference between mere fancy, the ordinary workings of the mind, and the infinite power of imagination. For more information, see this week's supplemental reading on Coleridge. But the comparison is still valid. One will realize, in fact, that the clever are always fanciful, but those who are really imaginative can only be analytical. I hope my simplified paraphrase will help you understand the first 3+ pages of The Murders in the Rue Morgue, because while the opening is only tangentially related to the story, it is an excellent piece of literary criticism to add to Poe's works of criticism. Notice the opening of the story. Once again, the story is written in first person, an unnamed narrator, just as in the purloined letter, the unnamed narrator would tell Dupin's story ostensibly from an objective viewpoint. The opening of the story gives us some characterization of Dupin that was missing in the purloined letter. In relation to the opening of the story, the narrator tells us, "At such times I could not help remarking and admiring a peculiar analytic ability in Dupin. He seemed, too, to take an eager delight in its exercise, and did not hesitate to confess the pleasure thus derived." Thus referring to Dupin's analytical skills, and then immediately proceeds to give us an example. We were strolling one night down a long, dirty street in the vicinity of the Palais Royal, both being apparently occupied with thought. Neither of us had spoken a syllable for 15 minutes at least. All at once, Dupin broke forth with these words: "He is a very little fellow, that's true, and would do better for the Théâtre de Vérité." "There can be no doubt of that," I replied unwittingly, and not at first observing, so much had I been absorbed in reflection, the extraordinary manner in which the speaker had chimed in with my meditations. In an instant afterward, I recollected myself, and my astonishment was profound. Yes, it would appear to the casual viewer, as indeed it apparently does to the narrator, that Dupin is capable of reading minds. Dupin proceeds to explain on pages 403 and 404 how he read the narrator's mind by observing a series of subtle clues such as the stones in the pavement, a smile, looking up at the stars, and so on. Have you ever sat in silence thinking and found yourself jumping from one topic to the next, and then suddenly stop and ask yourself how you got there? And then you're able to retrace your steps back to your starting thought? That's exactly what Dupin is describing here, how our brains work when we are thinking, or better yet, daydreaming, and how easy our brains lead us from one seemingly unconnected thought to the next. Dupin's skill of ratiocination is the ability to make those connections in someone else's thoughts by watching the subtle changes in their body language. Poe goes on for several pages giving us the depositions of various witnesses, which are the clues that we and Dupin need to solve the mystery. Dupin, of course, follow with the obligatory put-down of the police. "We must not judge the means," said Dupin, "by the shell of an examination. The Parisian police, so much extolled for acumen, are cunning but no more. There is no method in their proceedings beyond the method of the moment. They make a vast parade of measures, but not infrequently these are so ill adapted to the objects proposed." Which leads us to Poe's put-down of Vidocq, which we've already analyzed in our discussion of influences. The obligatory put-downs, of course, are the entry into the crime scene investigation, the same that Holmes and Watson use in their investigations. On page 417, Dupin gives us an excellent example of analysis or deductive reasoning, to borrow from Sherlock Holmes. The murderers were in the room when the police ascended the stairs, based on the voices heard, and the doors of the two rooms were locked from within. So the murderers could not have escaped out through the doors. And the chimney was too narrow for even a cat. So that leaves the windows. They couldn't have used the front windows, or the people in the street would have seen them. So the conclusion is that they had to have used the back windows. This type of reasoning thus helps to focus the search for additional clues that the police overlook, because they cannot see any way that someone escaped out the back windows, and thus are left in a quandary about how the murders escaped. Having discovered the mystery of the window behind the bed, and examining the back of the house, Dupin concludes that the murderer must be agile and strong, and notes that since the money was not stolen, the crime had no motive. So he turns to the peculiar description of the voice. The strangeness of the voice, plus the strength needed to commit the murders, might lead us to conclude that the murderer is an animal. But on page 423, Dupin reveals another clue that was hidden from us, and thus gives Dupin an unfair advantage over the reader. Dupin found non-human hair at the crime scene clutched in Madame L'Espagne's hand. That's a significant clue that I seriously doubt the police and definitely the medical examiner would have overlooked. So perhaps that alone was enough to give Dupin the answer to the mystery. but his other powers of reasoning are nonetheless impressive. Of course, we would not have had the clean conclusion to the story that we have unless the sailor had not come forth and told the rest of the details about what happened. I suppose we could argue whether the sailor is innocent or guilty. He'd clearly be charged with something nowadays. But this lecture is already very long, so I'll just close here with a hope that you now understand better the method of detective fiction that Poe invented.